Thank you everyone for joining us today and a very warm welcome. We are really delighted to have you here for our launch of the Communicating Hope, a Resource for Action, a new hope-based communications guide to mark Interfaith Week, which started yesterday and is continuing all of this week. My name is Wutsia Stremska and I'm the Communications Manager at René Cassin, the Jewish Voice for Human Rights. We work to promote and protect universal human rights in the UK, drawing on Jewish teachings, values, and historical experiences. We work within the UK's Jewish community by building support for human rights values amongst British Jews and in the wider community by bringing the authority of a Jewish perspective on issues that resonate with Jewish experience. The modern human rights framework was developed in response to the horrors of the Holocaust, and our namesake, Monsieur René Cassin, a French Jewish jurist, co-authored the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the first expression of a global commitment to protect human dignity, demand accountability, and act when others are persecuted. And we believe that as survivors of intolerance, discrimination, and persecution, and as experts by experience who understand the need for empathy and solidarity, the Jewish community has a uniquely authoritative voice in speaking out on other minorities or vulnerable groups in the face of discrimination, marginalization, and hate. I'm going to share my screen, so bear with me as I do that. For the launch. Hopefully you can all see my screen. So, the need for this guide came through the growing hate and hostility here in the UK, and a simple but a powerful question really of what if we change the way we talked about human rights? So what instead of centering fear, division, or loss, we hold stories that reflected dignity, justice, and a shared hope, especially from all of the things that we've seen, especially in the refugee sector, happening over the summer with the riots. In a world where headlines often amplify what's broken, this event and this resource specifically is about something profoundly different. How we can communicate in ways that build rather than break, that invite rather than isolate, and inspire rather than intimidate. So today we will explore how language and storytelling can become tools for solidarity, how through the worlds we choose, we can nurture belonging, resilience, and courage in the face of challenge. And whether you are a communicator, a campaigner, a faith leader, or an activist, this session is for you to help you along that journey. So it's an invitation to move from simply describing the world as it is to imagining and communicating the world as it could be, on grounded in human rights, compassion, and hope. So why does hope matter? So let us begin with that question. Too often communications become driven by urgency, alarm, and crisis. And there is obviously a place for that, of course. But when every message becomes about fear, when every appeal becomes about disaster, something important is lost. And that is a sense of possibility of change that people can act upon, and that together we are building a future, not just for reacting to a problem. So hope-based communications in that sense recognizes that what we say shapes is what we believe. So people internalize the story they hear. So if we only speak about danger and doom, we risk leaving individuals disempowered, passive, or fearful. So if instead we craft messages that point to possibility, dignity, and a shared responsibility, we can shift that narrative. So for organizations like René Cassin, we've anchored in Jewish values such as Tzedek, which is justice, Chesed, kindness, and cabot, which is dignity, showing that hope is not naive, but it is essential. It's the most moral engine that moves us from witnessing injustice to restoring it, from feeling powerless to acting with purpose. And this is what we built this guide on, is to the conviction that hope is in fact strategic and it's not merely inspirational. So it's the bridge between awareness and action. So these are some of the 6 principles of hope-based communications, which you can see on the screen. I will very briefly go through it, but the guide goes into these in a lot more detail. So these are the core in understanding how to utilize hope. So the first one is threats to opportunities. So we can illustrate how you target your audience can be brought together by listening to your audience and what behavior you want people to adopt. The second one is against for. So this shows how instead of operating through the prism of harmful ideas you want to tear down, you can find creative ways to build up truly radical values by celebrating the things that you want to see. Thirdly, problems to solutions. So this provides a tool to addressing problems. So for example, human rights are the glue that binds society together, for example. The third is opposition to change. So this allows you to notice what causes opposition and for you to act on it, planting seeds for a better tomorrow. The fifth one is fear to hope. So hope organizes and can open the door to empathy and action, as I mentioned earlier. And people don't always remember what you said, but they do often remember how you made them feel. So using this hope-based approach can really help you shift to a positive response to people when they hear your messaging. And finally, passive to protective. So often this offers an option for action and enabling your audience to become mobilized. Then we have what this guide actually offers. So as you can see here, the guide is at the bottom of the screen, and we'll share the links for this so you can read it in more detail after this event. So what does the guide include and what are its 4 features? Firstly, we really wanted to help you understand the 6 core hope-based communications principles. So again, as I mentioned earlier, really briefly, they guide you through those principles from framing messages in terms of possibility rather than just crisis, and centering on human dignity to ensure that your audience is invited into action rather than just showing the problem, because often you can cause a lot of panic with people not knowing what to do with that. It also offers practical examples. So we provide a lot of case studies and examples from our own communications and other organizations, including faith-based groups, community campaigns, and human rights organizations who are already using hope-based messaging. So you can see how to do it successfully. So we can show you what works, what doesn't work, and why with these key do's and don'ts within the guide. Thirdly, prompts and tools. So the guide includes templates, prompts and reflections, questions to help you craft your own hope-based messaging, whether you're drafting a social media post, writing a newsletter, or preparing a talk. You'll find tools that really help support you, because hope-based communications is a tool that can be used within a full range of communication rather than just one area of communication that you might be using. Fourthly, faith and value integration. So because René Cassin works at the intersection of human rights and Jewish values, this guide carries a specific focus on how faith-inspired organizations can integrate values into messaging in an authentic and strategic way. But we believe that these values aren't just add-ons, and that they should speak with clarity, integrity, and purpose that are also reflected within other core values that can be used as well. So it doesn't only have to apply to faith groups. Finally, measurement and impact. So we also spotlight how you know when hope-based messaging is working, what the metrics and why they matter, which shifts in tone, engagement, or behavior can change, because obviously a lot of the time with trying to measure impact and awareness raising is quite difficult, but there are ways that you can measure these. So by the end of this session, we aim for you to feel equipped to use this guide, inspired by its possibilities and ready to experiment with communications that reflect with hope, connection, and change. So when we look at these framings, we have different mechanisms of hope-based communications that work. So the first one you could use is framing in terms of possibility. So rather than saying, for example, I know a lot of you are refugee-based charities, saying refugees face discrimination and have no access to justice, for example, we might say more refugees can access justice and build their life or rebuild their lives when communities commit to the welcome, rights, and dignity. So this difference might feel really subtle, but the psychology and communications research shows that it matters, the subtle difference, and shows what is possible rather than so that people might be more able to act rather than showing this crisis again. Secondly, we want to invite action, not inducing guilt. So fear or guilt may generate attention, but they're rarely endanger situation action. So messages that invite people into what they can do rather than what they have done wrong create more engagement and empowerment in that sense. So an example of this is you can help ensure that every person fleeing persecution has access to a safe route. This is more engaging than we're failing refugees, for example. And thirdly, human-centered stories with dignity. A lot of us know that using personal stories is a very important aspect of communications. So using individual stories that emphasizes resilience, connection, and dignity, not only victimhood. So this gives people an entry point for empathy and action. And an example for this is a refugee who finds a supportive community and rebuilds, rather than simply a refugee who suffers. And then, of course, values-first messaging, which is what I briefly hinted on. So for faith organizations such as René Cassin, our mission led campaigns reminding audiences of shared values, kindness, and justice, and being welcoming reinforces identity, affiliation, and motivation. So an example of this, as you can see on the screen, that we've used to link between Jewish values and human rights guides added authenticity and depth for this instance because of the Human Rights Act, for example, which is its 25th anniversary this year. An example that we've used this for is a Jewish gay couple were able to get married to the loves of their lives because of the Human Rights Act. So again, this is using hope-based messaging in order to illustrate what the possibilities of the Human Rights Act are. So because of this, you can see, as you can see on the screen, truth and knowledge is understanding in rooting messages in values that we share. So this is one of the key guides within the guide itself. So through that sense, we can then stay consistent and coherent tones within social media, for example. So that's one of the ways that you can apply hope-based messaging through social media, because hope-based communications is not just a one-off hashtag, it's a tone and a consistent approach that you can use throughout all types of your messaging. So if one message is hopeful but others aren't, then you may confuse your audience and distrust. So what you can do with your communications is, including your social media, your newsletters, any communications, whether it's press or you're writing an article for journalists as well. And as you can see, a lot of the things that we've used here is using that hope-based approaches. So illustrating, for example, here with communities of where they can find detention centers near them, or sharing with other faiths and the positive approaches and hopeful messages that faith leaders, for example, such as Pope Francis, sent out, which is shared with other faiths as well, but also just on a wider scale as well. And you can obviously measure this through social media as well. So as I mentioned earlier, tracking what works is really important. So looking at metrics, whether it is on different social media outlets, so you can see how many people click to learn more, for example, share your content, sign petitions, and join webinars, because these are all really important metrics that you can use to see whether the approaches are working. But also consider qualitative signals. So are people asking questions? Are they feeling empowered? And by embracing these mechanics, you can build communications that are not only morally aligned with human rights, but also strategically accurate and effective. So bring it into your own work. You can bring this into your own work, whether you're a part of a faith community or a charity or you're a campaigner. And thus, the first step is to reflect on your purpose. So what human rights are you defending? What values are at the heart of your work? And then you can move on to step 2, which is choosing your audience, which a lot of you would already know, have a lot of insight into. Who are you trying to reach? What do they care about? What language and tone will connect them? And this will then help you understand how to use this guide. So by using this guide, you can see prompts of picking a story, highlighting resilience, and inviting actions. So what you can do is draft a piece of content, maybe a newsletter, a social post, video script, or apply it to one of the 6 principles that we've gone through on the guide. So do use it as a working document whilst you're promoting your communications to help you with that. And then you can test and refine and give monitor engagement and see whether this feels hopeful, whether it invited actions, and whether there is something else that you could tweak. And just remember that hope-based communication doesn't mean that you ignore reality. It just means that you hold the pain and the possibility together, that you name the injustice, but you also name the path forward from it. So just in closing of the guide itself, I want to return to a phrase that we use at René Cassin, which I hope will stay with you all today, which is human rights protect us all. This simple sentence reminds us that protections of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the European Convention of Human Rights, and our own Human Rights Act, the rule of law and the dignity of every person are not optional, they're not niche, and not only for others. They are part of the shared fabric of our society, and they belong to everyone. So communications is powerful in that sense because it can spread fear, it can sharpen divisions, it can amplify despair, but it also can do the opposite. It can spread hope, connect communities, and inspire action. And at this moment, with rights severely under pressure, voices of exclusion growing louder, the second choice has never been more or mattered way more. So because we are not just communicating, we are shaping culture, we are building solidarity, and we are defending justice, and we are believing in belonging. So just close my remarks there, and I will pass it over to Esther from IMIX. Esther Raphael is a professional campaigner, community organizer, and communication strategist. Over the last 10 years, she's worked on women's rights, trade union organizing, and currently specializes on work on migration and asylum at IMIX. In her current role at IMIX, she works full-time as a media and comms consultant for migration and asylum charities with a focus on narrative change. This includes safely connecting journalists with people who have lived experience of migration, supporting charities who want to pitch stories to the press, and providing media training. So Esther, over to you.
Hi everyone, thanks so much for having me. And thank you for that introduction. Apologies in advance. Someone has just started busking quite loudly outside my window. So if you can hear that, yeah, apologies. Very little I can do about it. Yeah, thank you so much, Butzia, for having me and for putting this brilliant guide out as well. There's so much wisdom in there, and I think there's so much to be said for designing something that can reach a real range of different community groups that have a really significant role to play in strategic communications, especially in the context of migration. So as you kind of hinted to, we work across the UK to develop messaging and crucially messengers around migration, including refugee and asylum issues, with a view to narrative change. We work with journalists, we work with mainstream media outlets, less mainstream media outlets, we work at a local level, regional and national level. And we think very carefully about who our audiences are, how to reach those audiences, and we go directly to the places where those people are and try and give local campaigners, local grassroots groups, the tools to communicate locally as well as kind of on a national scale, because this conversation is happening at a lot of levels at once. So obviously IMIX works primarily on migration, and hope in the context of our current discourse is quite a difficult thing to have. So I'm just going to kind of say that directly. It's a very difficult environment for convincing audiences and for building power. And I think kind of understanding that context is important of why that's so difficult in the current moment. Firstly, immigration salience is extremely high. So what I mean by that is this is an issue that is perpetually in the news cycle at the moment, to the point where it generates a sense that it's a bigger problem than it actually potentially is, just insofar as the issues that dominate the national conversation regarding a range of different problems that are facing the UK population. So salience is high. Meanwhile, trust in politics and in politicians is extremely low. And also trust is increasingly low in media and information sources. So broadly, groups of people across our kind of different audiences to the right and to the left are shifting in their relationships to both mainstream media and to social media and are overwhelmed by information. So that's kind of a complicated landscape that we're sitting in right now. The question is, what can we do in this context? And what does IMIX do? And how does that also kind of complement the potential for different faith groups in this space? So I think what we can do is identify who we can persuade, the people who are best placed to persuade them, and the values, ideas, and arguments that can plant those seeds, which Wutsi has already done an amazing job of outlining here with regards to this guide. And there's so much in there that you can utilize to think about your messages. In terms of, I guess, the latest research in understanding audiences and who we're actually talking to, there are a few sort of key trends that come out around what tends to work and can cut through the noise and reach people, I suppose, in what we would call the mixed middle, people who are neither actively hostile nor really bought into migration as a human rights issue and the positive role that migrants play in society, or just the right to exist and be here, regardless of contribution or positivity. So I think the first thing to say is, given this is kind of in the context of Interfaith Week, is faith organizations are really ideal candidates for the kinds of messages that work. So there are two, I guess, kind of the two big pieces of research that people are working with a lot in the migration space right now are More in Commons research around persuadable audiences and segmenting audiences into sort of 7 groups, and then also Hope Not Hate, who've done a lot more recent work around identifying and understanding reforms support coalition. And the key trends that come out of that are there's sort of 2 areas of messaging that work pretty well. One is around sort of celebrating multiculturalism and diversity. And the other is, regardless of the kind of argument you're making, is stories that are embedded in their local community. And as we've said, faith organizations, whether that's churches, synagogues, temples, anything that kind of is about building a third space that's community focused, they're really ideal for displays of community positivity and community solidarity, whether it's kind of an iftar or a local community church which hosts sanctuary seekers. These are all really ripe for great stories, whether that's for social media and digital work, or it's for kind of pitching to local and regional press. There's so many kind of community initiatives that I think that are based in faith spaces. And they really are also opportunities to challenge what we would call scarcity narratives. So, of course, people are very receptive to, understandably, because of the cost of living, ideas around migration and its relationship to public services and overwhelm and so on. And I actually think one of the places where there's on the ground real potential to build solidarity is often spaces where you have people who are homeless for various reasons in the same space, or you have people that have a shared faith from both the local community and who are maybe new to the community as migrants. And there are people who are often pitted against each other. You kind of get the classic sort of like dichotomy of like the homeless veteran versus kind of like sanctuary seekers. But there's real opportunities here on multiple levels for strategic communication. One is just getting people in a room together and having them talk to each other, which isn't really even about media. The other level of that is like looking at those stories and thinking like, if people need to understand that these spaces exist, and pitching them as up to the press, and using them as content for your own socials when you're talking about advocating for broader policy change. And this is something that IMIX has done really consistently with our work. We go into a lot of grassroots area. We work with a lot of grassroots groups in areas across the country that can be quite politically contentious. And we help develop people's skills to put out stories about local sports teams, hobbies, whether it's the Refugees Rock film that was made with the Daily Mirror recently, or kind of smaller refugee week stories that happen. Basically, building this kind of broader picture of the spaces that make our communities livable and real and community focused is extremely valuable for narrative change. Obviously, as a disclaimer, this is one piece of our puzzle, right? This is not to say that narrative alone is going to fix things or change things, but this is one piece of our community organizing work, which, if we do it at multiple levels, does have significant value. So that's kind of about where we do this, I suppose, and who our audiences are, which I'm happy to answer more questions about further down the line. The other piece of this is like the messages themselves. So we've kind of spoken about this. There's still like a significant group of British people that see diversity and diversity in the UK as a positive thing. There are people that see immigration. There are some people, unfortunately, that see it as a sort of cultural issue, in terms of the erosion of some kind of British identity, but that is still like one group. And I think this is a really useful place to start in terms of building a strong argument for a different kind of Britain. And it also gives us the opportunity to make a moral case for migration. We talk a lot about the complications of pragmatic arguments around migration as contribution in the economy and public services, which can be misappropriated and has been by the Labour government. And it's not to say those arguments are always misplaced or always wrong, but there is an opportunity to make a moral argument for migration because people care about diversity and want to be seen on a national and international level as open-minded and kind of community oriented, and what that looks like is kind of up for grabs still. And so I think, thinking about the messages that work in this context, and the guide that Wutsia was talking about, René Cassin's guide, does a really good job of kind of breaking that down. So I'm not going to do too much of that here, but I'm also going to remind people that it's not just about what people say, it's also about who is saying it. One of the most significant things here is that trust and authenticity will kind of always win the day. Ideally, that's combined with expertise, but it's about building trust. And once again, we come back to the fact that faith and people's relationships to their faith leaders are incredibly significant in this context. And people with lived experience of migration themselves often have faith backgrounds, and are often people of faith, or engage with faith communities. And so there's real opportunities there for building relationships, but also for developing messengers who themselves have lived experience but can speak to a faith context in order to have a wider audience of people in their local community. Lived experience has cut through, but also local organizers and kind of trusted local community people tend to have cut through. That's in people like teachers, nurses, social workers, people that are trusted within their community. And again, one of the things that we do as an organization is we think about those kinds of messages and how to make sure they feel like they have confidence to, whether it's taught to the media or taught to their local community. So think about messages, think about messengers. The other thing worth considering, again, is obviously the platforms that you're using. It's complicated. There's a really kind of really big range of platforms that are available. And it can be really overwhelming to think about where to invest your time and your capacity, especially if you're a small charity. So the thing we would always say to do is just to think strategically about your local and your regional context, and think about the kind of who your audience is and what they actually consume. So it might be that one area, there's a really significant Facebook community group and a lot of conversations happen on that group. Think about what you can do in that space, who can intervene, who can comment, who can be part of those conversations. Somewhere else, it might be that actually the local journal has a really significant role to play, and the local paper. And so then it's worth really investing time in building relationships with local journalists, whether that's actually your regional BBC, whether it's an even more hyperlocal journal. And then, of course, it goes without saying that we are now living in a space where social media and digital media has a really significant role to play. And again, the algorithms are ever changing and incredibly punishing in terms of who they reward with time. So one of the kind of cut-throughs or hacks here is often thinking again about your local and regional context. Like, what are the local community groups that are interested in potentially posting stories of work that people are doing in the migration and asylum space? Who are the local and regional influencers, not just these big nationals that can often be very difficult to reach and even have big PR these days, these kinds of influencers. So think about what influence actually means concretely in a digital space in your local community. And again, faith has a really significant role to play here. And I will also say that as much as we know that in the migration space, a lot of misinformation travels primarily through social media, don't underestimate traditional news sources, because they're still significantly consumed, and those news sources are on socials. So the BBC, ITV and Sky are still watched by probably the most influential audiences within what we would call the mixed middle. So it's still worth engaging with them and looking at the content that the news that they are making and thinking about how to pitch to them. I'm not going to go into full detail about how to pitch right now, but the main things I'll say are making it timely, making it pithy, and making it person-centered. So that's a kind of whistle-stop tour of like, what's the situation, what are some of the approaches that you want to take, and what's kind of the role of faith groups in that context. But obviously that really does include like a conglomeration of different organizations, big and small. But I think it's about understanding your power in the space, understanding like who you are trustworthy to, and talking to those groups, whether it's digitally, whether it's face-to-face, whether it's through the media. But yeah, I guess to conclude, this is a UK-wide effort, right? So every message has its messenger, every messenger has their audience, and there is no single story that can totally transform a hostile news environment. But together, we can move the needle if we scale this work. And this does really start from the ground up and from the grassroots up. And the guides that the guide that Woodsea and René Cassin have produced, this will reach communities and campaigners that IMIX might not be able to, for example. And so on and so forth. And we'll continue to build and champion grassroots, frontline, and lived experience voices and spokespeople to tell these stories and to build the narratives that challenge the climate that we're currently in. That we have a real range of resources as kind of a final plug, including some crisis comms resources of what to do when you're experiencing pylons, alongside our daily news roundup, where we write a roundup of all of the news on migration daily in your inbox, and a couple of other newsletters as well. So I'm happy to link all of that in the chat, but I will stop talking now and yeah, let things move on.
Thank you so much, Esther. And again, just to really highlight the importance of storytelling and the fact that this guide can be used alongside other guides as well to help you pitch to journalists, for example. Our next speaker is Josh Cass, who provides advisory services to charities and international organizations in the interfaith and education spaces, including Holocaust Memorial Day Trust, Plan for Peace, the Sigmund Cyber Charitable Foundation, and the list goes on and on and on and on. He is regularly involved to contribute for the FORB-related progress, particularly in intersection of FORB with matters relating to education, dialogue, and interfaith processes by organizations including the FCDO and the OSCE. Josh, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Witsy. That's a really kind introduction. And for those who might not be familiar, FORB is the freedom of religion or belief, and I'll say a bit more about that in due course. Esther, thank you also for your presentation. It was really interesting to hear about the value of applying this approach in the context of conversations about migration. Hello, my name is Josh Cass, and as has already been said by Witsy, well, actually, she didn't say that. I'm a trustee of René Cassin, and I've been working on questions of religion, education, human rights, and interfaith for nearly 20 years. I must admit that when Witsy invited me to speak on this panel, that I was rather nervous. In part, that was because although for many years I was a fundraiser at the Faith and Belief Forum, who are a national interfaith charity, and as many of us on this call will recognize, so much of fundraising is storytelling and comms, I would not describe myself as a campaigner or a comms person. But that was only part of it. Principally, my worry came from an anxiety within the interfaith community about how it talks about itself. So for the remainder of my input, I'm going to be talking about that question of perception and how hope-based communications might help. There's a tension which runs through the perception, and here I stress the word perception, of much of interfaith. Specifically, that interfaith is either all kumbaya, bagels and samosas, or it's trapped in a doom narrative that relations between faith communities are at an all-time low, that fear is pervasive and rampant, and the mere idea of dialogue is impossible. And just to be clear, I will come back to these unhelpful generalizations later. Speaking personally, as someone who values interfaith activities and the idea that interfaith can contribute to addressing many issues within society, this tension obviously concerns me. Furthermore, and in relation to the question of hope-based communications, the question of how we talk about interfaith is something which I think about a great deal. For me, the how is important because at the heart of interfaith work are the relationships which one is trying to build and cultivate. And central to those relationships is the issue of trust, which has been touched on earlier by both Esther and also in the guide. Building relationships between individuals and communities which are robust enough to get to a point where discussion of contentious issues is possible takes time. And it's not just about those already taking part in such activities. There is a need and awareness that new people and communities must be drawn into interfaith spaces and activities if the possibilities of such activities are to achieve their full potential. More than that, new audiences need to feel they can trust the conveners and holders of the spaces in which they are being asked to step into. So the context of interfaith is tough. There are, on the one hand, strong voices who will snipe and say that it is nothing more than bagels and samosas. And on the other, voices which will say that now is not the time for interfaith because anti-religious hate is so pervasive and levels so high. But at the same time, we know that problems relating to how communities live together will not be solved without activities like interfaith. So where does this leave the role of communications, and specifically hope-based communications for interfaith relations? As a non-comms person, I was fascinated to read the guide produced by René Cassin. There was a great deal that was new to me and things which resonated too. But I did come back to the tension which I described earlier. How to avoid sounding naive that bagels will save the world in the face of a context which is so hostile to the idea of positive interfaith relations. Given that it is Interfaith Week, I think that it is particularly important to think about how to craft a message which is engaging, honest, and grounded in a language which could be appealing to people looking for a different narrative to one which says that faith communities must be at loggerheads with each other. I mentioned earlier that I work on human rights. Specifically, I work on Article 18 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is the freedom of religion or belief. Inevitably, there is overlap between that work and the work that I do in interfaith and dialogue settings. And what colleagues and I have found, and this may resonate with experiences of others on this call, is that there can be a hesitancy and concern from faith communities when it comes to engaging with human rights. Indeed, I would go so far as to say, and certainly as it relates to freedom of religion or belief, that there is a risk that what one might call a classically human rights narrative has the potential to alienate faith communities. So what can be done? Well, when talking to colleagues in Lebanon who have done a great deal of work in this area, developing narratives which are rooted in the values of different faith communities as they relate to the issues at the heart of freedom of religion or belief has been an effective way to build shared messages which center human rights priorities. And so why do I mention all of this? Well, I would suggest that good communications, which is hopeful, proactive, inspires change, is solution-oriented, so hope-based communications, and which speaks to faith communities in authentic and honest ways, acknowledging the context but not being afraid of it, should also be rooted in the values of those communities. Now, the risk of that approach is that it could appear to be co-opting those values. But this is where the value of good interfaith becomes fundamental. And dare I say it, this is where all those bagels and samosas start to pay off. Because it is about building up relationships over time so that when the time comes for a shared campaign or a new communication strategy, the conditions are in place which, in spite of the reality of unprecedented high levels of anti-Semitism and the shocking normalization of anti-Muslim hate, Well, the conditions are in place which enable mobilization and engagement across lines of religious difference. So, this Interfaith Week, yes to bagels, yes to samosas, yes to the confidence to take part in challenging conversations about the experiences of religious minorities, and yes too to hope-based communications to build bridges between communities. Thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Josh. That's a really nice way of putting it all together, really. I would really love to open up to questions from anyone that has them. So please do use the question and answer chat section or within the chat sections yourself. And you can add your summary about emphasizing human and human rights as well. Was that a question for you, Josh? Yeah, so basically human and human rights itself being that. So does anyone have any questions? No, people are being shy. If no one has any questions, I think I'll go ahead and answer and ask you myself for both Esther and Josh. In terms of a lot of interfaith holidays are also coming up. Do you see there any benefits of relating human rights events or days that are coming up with interfaith holy days as well?
I'm happy to have a go at that, but I think there are two hands raised in the chat.
You're right, there are two hands. Sally and Danny, would you be able to write your credits? Oh, it's here, isn't it? Here we go. Okay. Sorry about that. Would you, yes, the recording and the resource link is already in the chat, and we will share the recording as well. One from Tom, thanks for a great session. There are many headaches for René Cassin or IMIX have been dealing with the media in practice, even knowing how to best to do with hope-based comms. Esther, would you want to go first?
Which one am I looking at? What's here?
Tom's one.
Is it from Anna, or I'm looking on
Tom, the second one.
Oh, sorry. What are the main headaches we have in dealing with media in practice, even when knowing how to best do hope-based comms? I think it depends on which media we're talking about. But obviously you don't have total control over your headlines. So that's one thing. You could have a really great piece that you pitch to the BBC or the Mirror, but you can't control the headline. You can suggest it, especially if you write a really, really good press release. And often what will end up happening is if you write a great press release, it'll basically just get copy pasted in. Like, journalists don't have a lot of time. So you kind of have to put that to your advantage and make things as easy for them as possible. I suppose that's a big one. Also, like, lack of safeguarding training. IMIX does a lot of safeguarding work, especially when we have people who have lived experience or any kind of lived or learned experience, which involves complicated cases of people that have often experienced trauma or adverse circumstances. And we work with, like, sometimes with journalists who they don't necessarily understand the amount of time that someone needs to prepare for an interview. We get calls and messages all the time from people being like, we want someone who crossed the channel, who's a woman, who was pregnant, and can they speak to Sky News Live in half an hour? The answer is going to be no. People don't understand the kind of needs of people who have those kinds of experiences in order to do a safeguarded and trauma-informed interview. That's probably one of the biggest issues that we face with journalists. The list could go on for a while. Those are the first ones that come to mind. I'm happy to answer more if you want to chat, drop me an email.
For us, it's actually been a really useful way to be able to navigate specific stories and draw attention to what we want people to understand within the wider context. I'll go to the next question. Anna, one thing I'm finding difficult is how to do people send of comms without putting sanctuary seekers at risk. We faced a poll, in the summer and don't want to put anyone at risk again. Esther, I guess this is more.
Yeah, I'm happy to answer this. There's a few different things I would suggest here. think it depends on, you have to evaluate the level of risk and you have to evaluate your options. So one thing that we do is, it's very rare for us to put someone who's still in the asylum system, we will always recommend to be anonymous. You have to choose a trusted journalist and make sure that you've kind of put in the time to do safeguarding work with the person that's doing the interview, and manage the expectations of the person doing the interview, make sure they're doing it for the right reasons and that they understand the risks of reading something or putting their voice out and seeing the potential backlash that they could receive in terms of the comment sections, particularly when things are posted on X and other more volatile social media channels, and balancing that against obviously the importance of putting those stories out there. That is one thing. There's also and one thing I will say is that IMIX has a lot of safeguarding resources that I'm happy to share with you. Including our safeguarding checklist that you can work through with anyone you're considering putting up for an interview, to make sure that they kind of have set really strong boundaries with journalists. So it's all about boundaries and kind of safeguarding, and I'm happy to go into more detail about that if you drop me a line about it. In terms of pylons, I think having good crisis comms, protocols in place is always really good in terms of being aware, like how you set your socials up. And again, that's something that I'm happy to kind of pass you on resources to. The last thing I'll say is we saw a really novel approach in Manchester from GMIAU, the Greater Manchester Immigration Aid Unit. And they put out something that got a lot of press coverage, which was a kind of collective statement from a group of sanctuary seekers in one of the hotels in Manchester, talking about their perspective, explaining what they were going through, but it was a group thing. And there was no individual name, there were no faces, and it got a huge amount of national and local coverage. And they didn't even try, I spoke to them about it, they didn't even try that hard, they didn't even pitch it. They just kind of put this out and it got picked up because it was quite a novel way of approaching it. So there are things you can do if you're working with individuals. There's also things you can do if you're there's also ways to kind of workarounds for that, like doing something from the perspective of a group. But yes, it's kind of an ongoing and increasing occupational hazard, I would say.
Great, thanks, Esther. I'm going to move on to Tahira's question. There was mention of the far right and ignoring them. I fear that by doing that will give them too much space to continue their madness. I say that they get too much space in the media. Agreed. What can we do about that? My way that we've been trying to deal with that is by not directly replying to what they're saying, but actually using hope-based comms to put out your messaging. And that is a way to counter it in that sense, is by the more hope-based approaches you can use to put out your messages and what you're campaigning more, the more that could be seen as, not giving them enough space. I don't know whether you have any other comments on that, Esther.
Yeah, I think it's a balancing act, right? Because the salience of the issue is really high, and bringing that salience down is, in some instances, warranted. Just the fact that it's taking up so much space, it's unlikely that it's going to continue to dominate the news cycle quite this much, one would hope, because it is insane. But I think in terms of ignoring them, there's two separate questions there, right? There's the question of the media cycle, the news cycle, and then there's the question of people actually being influenced by these points of view and finding them, right? So I guess that is a more strategically complicated question that breaks down to kind of the digital spaces that these people are in, and also being realistic about who's kind of too far gone in terms of time and capacity. Wutsi has talked about, putting out messaging which challenges their messaging. There's also a question of like, who is receptive to their point of view and what do we do to like shift those people? I think they of course get too much space in the media. There's not that much, I actually don't think, unfortunately, that we can do except for put out alternative stories and alternative messages and try and target people who are receptive to their views with messages that resonate with them as well. I mean, I guess the obvious example of this is someone like Zach Polanski, who's working from a populist kind of perspective to kind of challenge right-wing populism with left-wing populism. I'm sure people have a mixture of views on that, but that is like one approach, right? Is like taking back that space by using similar toned combative language. But yeah, there's multiple approaches that can be taken here, I would say.
Thank you. I'll move on to Lauren's question. How would you encourage young people to practice hope-based communications, not just as professionals? Josh, I don't know whether you have any comments on that in terms of your work. Oh, you're muted.
Sorry, which question were you looking at?
Lauren's question, how to encourage young people to practice hope-based comms.
Well, that's a very good question. I mean, as a non-comms professional, I don't know. I've got a tremendous amount to say on that point. But I think if I may be slightly critical, I think there is a risk in all of this around the instrumentalization. Sorry, I'll start that word again. The instrumentate. Oh, I think you all know the word I'm trying to say, but I can't get my teeth in today. The instrumental. Oh, that word of faith.
Instrumentalization.
Thank you. The faith communities. In my experience of doing faith work and working with faith communities, and I suppose I'm cautious of anything that doesn't take time to build relationships. And I think that the people on this call, I would imagine you're all, I suspect, but I don't know, many of you are working in local organizations with really understand the context. I would say that you know the answers to these questions already. And that there is something about connecting at a local level with people, with allies alongside you who might be working in slightly different sectors, who might be doing slightly different things. I honestly don't know the answer to the question about hope-based comms. How do you get more people to do it? But I do think that we need to be wary about how not to how to build equitable relationships with faith-based communities. That's the one thing I wanted to add.
Right. The other thing that I would also add is we try to embed it in a lot of the youth groups that we have talks at and give out actions to as well. So by building those relationships, we then send out a lot of the resources and events and actions that we have. And then they do end up using a lot of them a lot of the time also through our ambassadors program. So it's really building that relationship with specific youth groups and then being able to provide them with specific tools. What we've also noticed is a lot of youth groups and young people want actions and want concrete actions. And by using hope-based communications, it automatically allows and invites people to take action. So that could be a way you could try to embed that in that sense. But again, a lot of the time it is, unfortunately, as a lot of things in life, it is really trial and error, seeing what does work, what doesn't work. And if one approach doesn't work, then try to reframe the way that you're approaching them. It might generally just be a subtle change in language that may change the way that they interact with your work. But do drop me an email for any of you. We might run out of time, but still got some 10 minutes left. About all of these questions as well. Moving on to Jack, I think if you could send me an email, that might be more in depth because your question is very specific. So I will get back to you. Sally, about printing copies, we don't have any printed copies yet. We do have it on our website, but I can look into that. Danny, this guide is amazing. Thank you for putting this out. I'm just wondering, in practice, when most small faith groups and community organizers are so underfunded and comms doesn't have enough time and staff allocated, what steps should be taken from the media government level to make sure that stories are told? Is there funding to get good comms for small orgs? Is there movement to change algorithms, etc.? Esther, do you know about any?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the thing here is basically to use the infrastructure organizations in the sector like us, like IMIX, who have a lot of resources that we can share with you. Also, depending on where you are and what organization you're from, we can potentially provide media training so that you at least can understand how best to utilize your time and your capacity most efficiently. I think in terms of, algorithms, I don't know that much about that, but I think in terms of stories being told, I mean, again, that's why working with the media, that Faustian bargain of working with the beast that is the mainstream media is important, is that like you can get coverage for your work. And often it is these local community organizations that have the best stories. And it's just about finding a way to pitch them safely and securely to your, and also the other thing to bear in mind is don't forget about local and regional media. Most research shows that the kinds of people that you're trying to persuade are much more likely to engage with their local and regional media than they are with national stuff. So focus on what's around you. Think about building relationships with the groups that are around you. Obviously, really depends on your area. I've worked with a lot of grassroots groups in areas where their local media is quite hostile. I've also worked in places where they're quite friendly. So it depends where you are, and it depends what tools are at your disposal. But you've probably got more access to kind of widespread to things that are going to amplify your voice than you think. But I'm happy to talk it through with you if you want to drop me a line.
I think the other thing I would add to that, in terms of, we know the comms is very underfunded, especially a lot of charity sectors as well. What we tend to do a lot of the time is we have the same messaging. You will also have, most charities have the same messages that they want to put out. It's just reframing it or recycling what you have in a way, but just change the wording, and that might make it all the difference. And you can make different outputs from that one message or narrative that you put out, which is your campaign. You can put out different outputs, whether it's a story that you have you want to pitch to journalists, as Esther mentioned, or whether it is a newsletter that you're writing, or whether it's a social media outlet. There's a lot of different areas where you can segregate these things that ultimately have the same message, but just framed in a different way. And this is ultimately what we wanted the guide to do, is to be able to help areas that are very underfunded to be able to tackle and use a more of a hopeful perspective on the areas of campaigning that we do use. Henry, I think I hope your question was answered in when we spoke about far right already.
One thing I'll say on that is just basically that often it's good to organise a counter event on a different day. The kind of big adversarial counter protests that are sort of directly confrontational, they don't generate a particularly positive response. I would suggest thinking about running events and community work that supports whether it's local sanctuary seekers or other causes in a different context, kind of separate rather than adversarially. But that is also it depends on the context.
Thanks, Esther. There's another one for you. So from Nadia, what could the biggest challenge to engage people on human rights topics according to your experience?
Accessibility and language. I think with human rights, and obviously, I mean, I used to work at René Cassin as well, so we've done loads of work on this over years, and René Cassin does great work on this. But I think it is basically accessibility and understanding that rights-based language doesn't always have cut through, and so it's thinking about creative, innovative ways to make these issues tangible to the individual. I think rights discourse, the legalese that surrounds it, it's very easy to get caught up in it when you work in the sector and when you really care about this stuff, but the issues can get lost. So it's how do you sort of recenter the issue and then ultimately link it back to the policy or the issue you're trying to talk about, but you have to really center the issue, and that is the hardest thing. And I think also just general fatigue around these issues is really difficult. So it's finding ways to remobilize and galvanize people. Probably the biggest thing.
Thank you, Esther. We have time for one more question. I'm going to go with Melanie's question. And if we haven't answered all your questions, do send me an email, and I'll try to get back to you as quickly as I can with your questions. So Melanie says, with the recent wins of the Greens, what should we invest in messaging that recognises the growing pains of people at large and those responsible and benefits from scapegoating migrants? It obviously seems like the more we talk about or ask people to be compassionate with others, the less we point the finger at real villains. If we want to be unified, we need to recognise the systems we all experience. Would love your thoughts. I don't know, Josh, if you want to jump in at some point, also let me know. Esther, I don't know whether you have any thoughts first.
I mean, it's both, right? It's both things, and it depends on the audience. Some audiences don't care about the fact that Thames Water have been pumping raw sewage into their water, and that's probably one of the bigger villains in this situation in terms of who's causing real harm in the UK. other people really do care about that and really do care about the private companies and the corporations that benefit from the migration industrial complex. I think it really depends on your audience. Some audiences, I mean, a lot of them, I've seen a lot of message testing recently around sort of like memes and social media work that digitizes these issues and tries to show them to different groups. Generally speaking, people who are slightly more hostile to migration, it's harder to shift their outlook on who the villains are, and it's more effective to show them productive solutions and alternatives. This is not like, I mean, it's not ideal, right? It's frustrating. I would love for more people to talk about the fact that there's a huge number of people in the UK that benefit from migrants remaining the primary scapegoat for such a big range of issues in the UK and the world, of course. But I think you just have to be careful about where you put your focus and just think really concretely about your audience.
Can I just very quickly add, for me, I mean, and seeing as it's Interfaith Week, I suppose I should finish on this point. Like, for me, so much of this is relational work. Yes, there is a comms element, and I'm not here to diminish the comms element, but I think that you know, where I have seen the most effective work taking place is where time has been invested in building for whatever outcome, whether it's in terms of whatever the outcome might be. It's in how do we invest time in building relationships with people different to ourselves? How do we build trust? How do we work alongside one another, listening to one another's concerns, and working to come up with solutions? Now, then, that may be an imperfect answer to the question of how do we tackle systemic injustice. I don't have a better answer. I'm not sure that I necessarily, as one person, or even we as individuals within relatively small institutions, have the resources and capacity to do more than build solidarity, listen to one another, and across lines of difference in new and creative ways. That for me feels like something that I can do tangibly, and I think I can hopefully inspire and encourage others to do that work too. And that's where I would focus my energy.
And just to add to that as well, just to build on what Esther and Josh also mentioned, it's not saying that you can't pinpoint the, you know, the scapegoating that's happening, as you can use other values to then shift the narrative in that sense and bring out what the message that you want with a concrete action as well. Because hope-based comms isn't just for social media, for example, and it's not only about showing compassion, it's also other values that you can use. So if maybe compassion isn't working for you specifically, you can choose another value in order to illustrate your point as well. Again, it's all trial and error, which is the most frustrating thing, but you can see whether different outputs do work. And I've noticed myself on René Cassin social media and messaging, when we implemented more hope-based approaches, they do engage the right audiences that you do want to target even more. So that would be my 2 cents in that. But just wanted to thank you so much, both Esther and Josh, and for everyone attending today. If you enjoyed today's event, it will be recorded, and I will share the link around for everyone else to share with people that couldn't make it. And if you want to rewatch it at some point, please do sign up to our newsletter to hear more about our future events. We do more webinars like this and also evening events on specific days. We have a Kinder Transport event coming up, and on Thursday we have a human rights, a moral compass event, which is in person. Please watch our other events on YouTube, on our YouTube channel, and support our work by making a donation if you can. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you for having me. Bye.